I'm Sucharita Kodali, and I'm a retail analyst at Forrester. I've been at the company for more than 15 years, covering retail, e-commerce, and shopping behaviors. One of the biggest questions that we get asked is how much of what has happened through the pandemic is going to last, and are all the gains that e-commerce had gathered in the last year, are they going to stick? Is there going to be some sort of reversion back to physical stores? And I thought that a good way to frame that discussion is to talk through Forrester's latest e-commerce forecast. So before the pandemic, we had the numbers in the light green. And this was actually a forecast that was done kind of as we were heading into the pandemic, and the outlook was that retail in 2020 would be about $681 billion online. And what ended up happening was that it was even higher than that. It ended up being almost $800 billion. And through 2024, we expect everything that happened in 2020 to actually stick and to continue to grow. So where we ended up, and this is the big point that I think is the huge takeaway, is that the amount of penetration in e-commerce, so the percent that consumers were spending in online sales as a percent of all of their retail spend is now more than 20%. So in 2020, it shook out at 21%. And by 2024, we expect that figure to grow to 28%. So this is huge. And for eBay sellers, this is a big deal as well, because the more that you're able to resonate with consumers, the more that you're able to capture your fair share of that growth that is not only large, but continuing to get even bigger across virtually every category of consumer spend. What is the consumer's attitude, and what has the economy meant to shoppers? And I thought that this data was a really, really nuanced picture of a lot of what we're seeing. So on the one hand, we have on the left-hand side the impact of COVID, which is that consumers are obviously very, very concerned about their economic outlook. They are careful about how they're spending money. They're cutting back on expenses, and they're in many cases delaying transactions that they may make otherwise. But on the other hand, what that means is that they are very circumspect about what they do purchase when they purchase. And what we see is that consumers are spending a lot of time researching things. 77% of people, in fact, say that they are looking around and they're using the resources that are available to them, whether they may be offline or online. It could be asking friends and family for word of mouth referrals for products and services. It could be an extensive amount of online research to find what are the best products, particularly for higher consideration goods. And the other piece that is incredibly important to keep in mind is that when consumers buy, it's not always about the cheapest price. And that's what the data in the bottom right-hand side illustrates, which is that only 32% of people say that they try to just purchase the cheapest item they can. And I think that presents a really, really important insight into the reason to have value in any type of transaction, and to communicate that value, so that whether it is about the quality of a good, or whether it's about whether or not consumers actually find that particular good serves the needs of the consumers in a way that others don't. Another issue that we have been grappling with as an economy is, of course, the rate of inflation that we are seeing. And there have been a number of issues that seem to be driving this. It is, of course, the economic recovery. It is supply chain issues. And one of the insights that I thought was interesting was a study that the Fed did in breaking down the type of inflation that we're seeing. And some of it they believed was relatively sensitive to the pandemic and some of the factors that were very, very specific to the pandemic, and others, like actually housing, which are even outside of the pandemic, because a lot of that is driven by the supply of housing that is available. That's in fact less of an issue than factors here, in particular, healthcare services. And a lot of the inflation there is because many consumers either held out or didn't have as much in the way of their appointments and kind of the services that they needed. 2021 was taking advantage of a lot of those backlogs, and as a result of that, you saw a supply and demand imbalance. So therefore, you saw some of that increase in pricing. And then the other piece was used cars. And of course, as consumers were choosing, because of the pandemic, not to use public transportation, and they may have wanted their own vehicles, and of course, the shortage in new cars being available because of the semiconductor shortage, you had that need for used cars going up. And that too has created a significant amount of inflation in those two categories. And those are both things that the Fed has suggested actually are going to go down. It should normalize by the end of the year. And some of these concerns around inflation should become better. We also have consumer confidence improving substantially over 2020. So this is data from the U.S. Census's Household Pulse Survey. They do surveys every few weeks where they are capturing consumer insights on different attitudes. And they've been capturing this through the pandemic just so that we as researchers have the ability to see if consumer behavior is changing, if consumer attitudes, more importantly, are changing. And what you see here is when you look at June 2021 data, which is some of the more recent data points that they've shared, and you look back to how about this time last year was for a statement like, I'm expecting loss in my employment income, that figure was substantially higher at this time in 2020. It was even higher as the pandemic was starting and was in its beginning days back in April of 2020. We're down to relatively low double-digit percents of consumers who find that their expected income loss is going to be higher now than it was in the past. So we have an improvement, and that's good. All of this points to recovery. All of this points to continued sustained recovery. Consumers not necessarily pulling back on transactions because they're afraid that prices will be higher in a few months or that their dollars won't get them further. So this is all, I think, ultimately good for the e-commerce industry and all of the sellers in this ecosystem. Another outcome of the pandemic, of course, was bankruptcies. And I do want to call out that in 2020, we had a higher number of retail bankruptcies than we'd seen in a number of years. But there are some important nuances in this data to consider. First, there are so many retail establishments, and the number that actually survived, and actually there are a number that even opened in the course of the last year that aren't captured in this data. So I don't want to spend an onerous amount of time, lamenting the data here, because 2020 looked like a worse year than the retail apocalypse of, even 2017. One of the things that I did think was interesting to call out is that typically when we do see bankruptcies, it's often in sectors like apparel. But what we did see in 2020 is in the light green, a higher number of non-apparel merchants that actually went out of business and or closed their doors versus those in the apparel space. So if anything, this suggested more of a culling of the herd across lots of different categories. What this means is that many of these categories overall continue to not shrink. They continue to at least maintain their size. In some cases, they grow. And what that means is if these physical stores were the ones that go out of business, that just provides a little bit more oxygen to some of the e-commerce companies and others that continue to remain behind. Another major trend that we have seen in the e-commerce ecosystem, and even more broadly in the retail ecosystem and consumption in general, is a consumer interest in corporate social responsibility issues. And this is something that we have been hearing a lot about over the last several years, is this shift from essentially just a shareholder capitalism to a new expression that we called stakeholder capitalism. And what that means, and this is a pretty big deal in the business world, is that whereas in the past and historically, the value of companies was really driven by what they were delivering to their shareholders, how profitable these companies were, whether or not their the key metrics of their economic success was in line with other companies. That was primarily the driver of value for businesses. But what you see now is the notion of shareholder capitalism, where the value of companies is more than just the value to shareholders and whether or not they're just profitable, but whether or not these companies actually generate good paying jobs, whether or not these companies contribute to their local communities, whether or not these companies are actually concerned about the environment, and they take actions that don't make the environment worse. And all of these are essentially the components of stakeholder capitalism. And when consumers specifically think about, well, what does corporate social responsibility mean? It means everything here on this slide. It's everything from giving back to a local community, and I think that is where the idea of small businesses, local businesses being able to employ people, where some of the spreading of the wealth of a business is incredibly important to actually look at and measure. You also have environmental protectionism, and then also the top thing on the slide, which I thought was also really interesting, is when people think about a responsible business, that businesses stewardship of your data and of privacy elements are incredibly important to shoppers. So as a seller, some of the things that you want to be thinking about are, kind of protecting consumer information, kind of showcasing the localness, the local nature of your business, telling your story about, particularly if you do have a great environmental story or a great sustainability story, that you're showcasing that as well. Some companies are actually doing this really well, and in the absence of standardized data around things like sustainability or how environmentally conscious a business may be, there are some companies whose lead you could consider taking because they're actually showcasing this data themselves. And they have ratings around, for instance, what is the carbon footprint of their particular product, or how they manufacture things in a way that could be more sustainable than others. There are companies that actually provide a percent of, kind of that transaction, some kind of a carbon footprint offset. And, they also have other types of offsets as well. It could be a plastic offset or, kind of an ocean cleanup offset. And to be able to capture some of the data around those types of initiatives and to be able to expose them to shoppers are things that very much are things that consumers and shoppers are receptive to. And as I said, there are these companies like Allbirds that could provide great frameworks that you can think about and consider as well. Another area within the retail, particularly e-commerce world, that continues to get a lot of attention, and I want to call out some of the outcomes of COVID. One of the topics has been the speed of delivery. And leading up to COVID, what we saw was that retailers were investing in faster and faster shipping, and that raised the bar for every player in the ecosystem to try to deliver products to consumers consumers as quickly as possible. But we saw a couple of things happen. One is that because of basically the amount of e-commerce transactions that were happening, we saw a slowing down of a lot of e-commerce orders. And what we saw was that, kind of even in the best of times, as we were heading toward pretty broad vaccine dissemination, 20 to 30% of consumers still saying that they were getting e-commerce orders late at any given time. And that figure was even higher when we were in the depths of some of the worst parts of the pandemic, and when we had the greatest number of lockdowns, when people, in fact, had to shop online. They didn't even have the option to really go to physical stores. What we also saw, though, is that a relatively small percent of people, only 17%, said that same day would actually divert their decision as to where to shop. So you have this 1-2 punch where not only were orders not necessarily going on time, but people actually said they didn't really care about that. That leads us to a reality with e-commerce, which is that more important than the speed of delivery is transparency to the shopper as to when that package is going to come. So the more visibility that you're able to provide early in the transaction as to when is the order going to ship, when is, are you planning on shipping it in a 2-day fashion or, a 3 or 4 day cycle, when can that shopper expect to receive it, and then to provide them that persistent information through the course of the shipment itself. Now, that hasn't stopped venture capitalists from really, really leaning into this. This has also been one of the big trends of 2020 and 2021 is for dense urban areas in heavy investment to the tune of billions of dollars in hyperlocal delivery. So you have any number of companies. You have, players in Berlin like Gorillas. You have players in the U.S. like Duffel and Fridge No More. GoPuff is really probably one of the biggest ones in the U.S. now. And these are all companies that are essentially, they have micro-fulfillment centers in dense urban areas, and they promise essentially grocery products or convenience store products. It could even be products like Jewel Pods that are delivered to consumers sometimes in as short as a 10-minute time frame. So you can imagine how close that micro-fulfillment center needs to be for somebody on a bike to be able to take that to somebody's home that quickly. I'm a little bit skeptical about these types of businesses because, especially even in markets like the United States, where you have a substantial percent of the population that doesn't even live in dense urban areas, this runs the risk of being essentially another Cosmo 2.0. And unless you are able to get to, and Cosmo, of course, was a company that offered in the first .com boom to give you a Snickers bar, with no delivery charge. There's not really a great way to make the economics of that work. That unless you can get to a higher average order value, it doesn't make a ton of sense. So I just urge you as a seller to be aware of trends like this, but not necessarily to think that this is going to be transformative to the retail ecosystem. A couple of more things that I do think are important to keep in mind and to take into consideration. As we've mentioned earlier, we see this big trend of more commerce being transacted online, more people buying more through e-commerce across a variety of different categories. And what that also means is that your ability to reach those shoppers is often reliant on a number of digital touch points. And what we have here is a variety of different consumers and their self-reported data on how they researched transactions in different categories. And certainly in categories like consumables, such as grocery, there tends to, in general, be less research, although there are, absolutely a non-trivial percent of people that will visit everything from coupon sites to shopping sites to make sure that they're getting the best value that they can on things like food. But even for higher ticket items and higher consideration products, we see all kinds of research across the entire ecosystem of how people research. And it could be content like like blogs or online articles that may be written by professionals. It could be looking and discovering things that they may see on social media sites or through a brand's page on an Instagram feed or on YouTube. It could be even explicitly shopping sites that aggregate discounts or are aggregating various types of products. But what I think is the takeaway here is that you have to be mindful of marketing across different channels and across those different touch points. And in the same way that traditional marketers spend time and money generating demand and attracting consumers by even using brand awareness so that they can push people into a shopping funnel, that every brand, particularly if you have unique products, you need to do equally as much. Another thing to keep in mind is that there is still a huge opportunity with retaining your existing shoppers. The vast majority of people who purchase, especially when they purchase online, are purchasing online at retailers they have purchased with before across almost every category. And so the more that you can continue to delight your existing customers, that is great for you, because that is the option for a retained customer, someone who will come back to you because they did have a good experience the first time, and it was just relatively frictionless for them to think about going back to where they went before, in this case, eBay. Now, there are also consumers that are new and are open to being persuaded to purchase something new. And that is where, for those new consumers, things like the best price, and even making sure that you have the right variety of products, that you have the right assortment available to them, those are all incredibly important for those shoppers as well. I want to wrap up this presentation with just a couple of points about the holiday season, because I imagine that that's probably at the or if it's not already at the forefront, it will be shortly, of your planning, especially because it's only a few months away. And typically we see consumers starting their holiday shopping, in some cases as early as September, definitely by October, and often you have a significant portion of it even completed by the month of November. And often planning needs to happen in the summertime in order to make sure that you are in a good position for capturing those November and December sales. So what we saw in 2020, not surprisingly, was an enormous burst in e-commerce in the holiday season, and likely if you were selling on eBay at that time, you probably saw that burst, especially if it was a category like electronics or home appliances that were in high demand, particularly last year. We saw higher growth in e-commerce in 2020 than we had seen for any of the years that we've been measuring it in the last decade. And now what that means for 2021 is that it will likely go back down and normalize. It will likely be in the teens, probably the low teens from a growth standpoint. So it won't be nearly as great of a 2021 as it was in 2020. But the good news is that, and we saw this on the earlier slide, is that e-commerce will still hold on to its gains. So everything that worked in the playbook of 2020, you want to continue, and then hopefully you'll be able to also see some of that growth through 2021 as well. So what does that mean for different sellers, and what are some things that are in your control that you can activate? And from a marketing standpoint, some of the things that we see as being incredibly important is to recognize that carriers and shippers still continue to be overwhelmed. There wasn't quite the Shipageddon in 2020 that some people had speculated would be there, but we have for years been talking about the shipping system being stretched by e-commerce, and too many e-commerce orders being crushed in the system in too short of a period of time. So what that means is to pull some of those promotions earlier into November and then to raise prices into December to throttle demand could actually be a good thing. So you want to also focus on things like some of those value-based consumers who may really want to help small businesses. They may want to help local businesses. They may want to really focus on sustainable products. So take advantage of your ability to tell your story there, because behind every eBay product detail page is a seller. And the more that there is a personal story to be shared, the more that's likely to resonate as well. From a service standpoint, post-purchase notifications, any ability that the shopper has to understand where their transaction may be, or especially if it's going to be delayed, that is made as transparent as possible is crucial. From a fulfillment standpoint, we talked about those earlier options. We talked about even if it's going to be slower, just to make sure that that's as transparent as possible and that you warn consumers, even on a product detail page, if something is going to take a little bit longer so that the shopper just has visibility into that timing. Also, if there's any omni-channel capabilities, like such as store fulfillment, those are things that can often be helpful for sellers, but also, especially if you're offering any type of a local delivery option, that can be attractive to consumers as well. And then from a security standpoint, things like application security and bot management, those are things to really talk to your platforms about to make sure that things like that are also being taken care of. So my key takeaways from some of these things that we've seen through 2020, that we're seeing in 2021, and that we expect through the holiday season in 2022 is to recognize that the purchase journey continues to be complex. It's always had a number of touch points, digital and otherwise, from top of the funnel research to professional content to user-generated content. And the more that your products and services and solutions can be part of that exploration process, the more likely that you will be to be an item that consumers add to their shopping carts. Promotions and coupons. This is something that I do want to talk a bit about because they matter for consumers, yes, but even more important is this confluence of brand plus quality plus value. People aren't always looking for the cheapest thing. So the more that you're able to use photography, ratings and reviews, your copy, your product copy to tell your story about value, the better. Promotions are going to be important for what I'll call recovery categories. And to us, recovery categories were those categories that didn't do well in the pandemic, such as apparel or restaurants or travel, but are now almost experiencing this huge crush of demand. And one of the biggest things that you want to think about in categories like that is to make sure that you have enough inventory, because particularly if you do have promotions in October or November to support the holiday season, that there's adequate inventory to do that. Promotions and sales are important for first-time buyers, particularly for new brands and retailers, because price is a lever of conversion. But for retained customers to get retention, it's often service levels and value. Social issues absolutely matter to consumers now more than ever, and consumers want to support local businesses. They want to support small businesses, even sole proprietors. So, make sure that is messaged on product detail pages, that your seller descriptions, kind of have the information that can be important there. And I also encourage any information that could be also relevant from an environmental messaging standpoint, a sustainability standpoint, or a diversity standpoint too, because consumers talk about the importance of that as well. well. And also from a geographic standpoint, I think that, you probably recognize this as a seller, is that you have the ability to use e-commerce to attract a much, much broader audience than you ever have before. But to continue to ride that wave, because as you saw on my very first slide, e-commerce is growing phenomenally, and it's expected to grow from almost a fifth of all of retail to virtually a third just in a few years. And you want to make sure that you're capturing your fair share of that. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my presentation. This is my contact information. If anybody wants to reach out to me or get a copy of any of these slides, it's first initial, last name at Forrester.com. And you can also follow me on the social media that I do use, which are Twitter and LinkedIn. So with that, thank you very much for listening. And I hope that this was useful insight for you.